Today, there is deep pain in the Middle East, on both sides. The world watches as Palestinians suffer the humiliation and frustration of curfews and checkpoints, a constant military presence in their cities.
But by their actions and their nervous behavior, here, for example, arresting a street trader, they merely further inflame the Palestinian hate.
Israel says it's forced to impose these measures to prevent further acts of Palestinian terror. And so the Palestinians escalate their attacks to avenge Israeli militancy and bring an end to what they consider to be the Israeli oppression. How did we get here? After World War II, the United Nations declared that the time had come for the Jews to officially return to the land of Israel and rebuild their ancient homeland. The United Nations decision was rejected by the Arab world. The very day the state was declared, Israel was attacked by 5 Arab countries. The source of the conflict is clear. 2 peoples fighting for the same small piece of land. The Arab world sees the Israelis as colonists, usurpers. But with the creation of the State of Israel, the Jews were stealing Arab lands.
We're talking about the land and the owner of the land. Nobody can deny the fact that the Palestinians are the owner of Palestine.
One of the claims that the Palestinians make is they're the equivalent of an indigenous people in North America, like the American Indians, that they've always been here and that they've been unjustly uprooted from their homes. You know, if there really is an equivalent to indigenous people, it would be the Israelis, who have always existed on that land. The Jews have always been there throughout history. There's always been a presence.
Who were the people who were here in the Solomon's time, who were here in the Saul's time, who were here in 1800? I see a Jewish connection all throughout these ages.
You know, you have to differentiate between Jews and the colonial Zionist movement. We haven't any conflict with the Jew. Nothing to do with Judaism. The problem is with colonial movement, which is the Zionist movement, to come to colonize.
But the Jews deny that they are colonists. They cite a divine promise and an uninterrupted presence in the land of Israel for over 3,300 years. This historical right was confirmed in 1922 when the League of Nations formalized the British mandate to reconstitute the Jewish national home in that country. 2 peoples, 1 land, a festering conflict. The question is, what steps has each side taken towards resolving the conflict, towards peace? In 1947, the United Nations proposed a resolution, a compromise, to partition the land into separate Arab and Jewish states. 2 states for 2 peoples.
Palestine, where news of the United Nations decision to recommend partition brings wild jubilation among the Jewish communities in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. A vivid contrast to the bitterness felt by the Arab peoples as the troubles of the Holy Land enter a new phase, perhaps the gravest yet.
Israel accepted the plan. The Arabs rejected it and immediately instigated bloody battles to destroy the embryonic Jewish state. The Arab attacks did not succeed. Due to their rejection of the 2 states for 2 people compromise, the Arabs living in the West Bank and Gaza found themselves without any state at all, forced to live under Jordanian and Egyptian rule from 1948. Then, in 1967, the Arabs mobilized again for war. In 6 days, Israel emerged victorious and won the battles over the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. The Palestinians now found themselves under Israeli rule. Between the wars, the Israelis were hit with a steady stream of terror attacks.
Once again, comes to Jerusalem with the blowing up of an entire shopping center in Ben Yehuda Street, burying scores of victims under tons of rubble. Here, in the heart of the city, a devastating blast for which Arab quarters later claimed responsibility.
And the terror continues to this day. To defend against terror, the Israelis clamp down on the Palestinians. And in retaliation, the Palestinians lash out with more acts of terror. And so the Israelis clamp down again. In 1993, a plan was devised to end the bloodshed and bring peace to both peoples. It was a dream that began in Oslo. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, U.S. President Bill Clinton, and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat later came together to sign a revolutionary agreement. Until Oslo, it was illegal for an Israeli to negotiate with the PLO, a self-proclaimed terror organization responsible for the murder of Jews and Israelis worldwide.
The PLO chairman, Yasser Arafat, denounced for decades as a terrorist, was welcomed at the White House.
Oslo would lay the vital groundwork for each side to achieve what they wanted most, namely, a land the Palestinians could finally call their own, and an end to the terror attacks so that the Israelis could live in peace and security.
Finally, the time is approaching when there will be safety in Israel's house, when the Palestinian people will write their own destiny.
This was the Land for Peace deal, the first real step towards fulfilling the Palestinian demands for an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, lands won by Israel in the Six-Day War. The Palestinians wanted Jerusalem as the capital of their new state. The Palestinians wanted the removal of all existing Jewish homes and settlements that had developed in the West Bank and Gaza region. The Palestinians wanted to see the return to Israel proper of the descendants of the 600,000 refugees that had fled the country in the 48 and 67 wars. The Palestinians claimed that there were up to 4 million family members now eligible to make their home within the borders of Israel. Even though every one of these demands represented a potential threat to Israel's security and survival,
the time for peace has come.
Israel was willing to trade land for peace. Before all the Palestinians' demands could be considered, there needed to be a true sense of trust between the two peoples, and the Oslo Accords were designed to achieve just that.
My people are hoping that this agreement, which we are signing today, will usher in an age of peace, coexistence, and equal rights.
Mr. President, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Enough of blood and tears. Enough!
The time for war was over. This a time for peace.
It is a revolution.
The Oslo deal was unique. Rather than negotiating the major issues, they chose instead to sidestep them in order to first create an atmosphere of mutual trust and understanding. Oslo was therefore not a final peace deal, but the start of a peace process, and it called for a 5-year period in which both sides would take concrete steps that would improve relations and increase goodwill between the two peoples. At the end of this 5-year period, they would return to the negotiating table to deal with the Palestinian demands. Only this time, not as enemies, but as partners, with a common goal. Here is what Israel committed to at Oslo. Israel agreed to recognize the PLO, who would no longer operate as a terror organization, but rather as a legal governing body, now to be named the PA, the Palestinian Authority. Israel agreed to transfer land over to PA control, the exact amount to be determined in a series of interim deals. Israel committed to educate its public towards peace and to prepare the Israeli population for the difficult compromises that would need to be made in order to allow for the establishment of a Palestinian entity right next door. Israel agreed to allow the creation of a PA police force of up to 10,000 members on the provision that there be no terrorists on staff. And finally, Israel agreed to supply the PA with arms and weapons in order to help them police their own people and destroy terror. And these were the Palestinian commitments at Oslo. The Palestinians agreed to end all PLO terrorist activities. They agreed to recognize Israel's right to exist, which means they would have to amend the PLO National Charter, which calls for the destruction of all of Israel through violence. The PA committed to destroy all terror groups and confiscate illegal weapons. The Palestinians committed to preserve and protect all Jewish holy sites that fall under PA control in the transfers of land. The PA agreed that all future problems with Israel would be solved by negotiation only, and never again to revert to terror. And finally, the PA undertook to educate their people for peace. This included an end to public incitement towards violence and hatred. The world was so optimistic about Oslo that the leaders shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994.
I believe it is fitting that the prize has been awarded to Yasser Arafat.
Oslo was dubbed the Peace of the Brave. Both sides were taking major controversial steps. For the first time, the Palestinians were giving up their longtime dream of destroying all of Israel in favor of a two states for two peoples option. And Israel faced the risk of creating a terror state right in its backyard if the PA didn't live up to its commitment to end terror. By way of illustration, if the Palestinians controlled the entire West Bank region, Israel would be left with a thin waste of only 9 miles at its narrowest. This is what the United States Joint Chief of Staffs termed indefensible borders in a 1974 report. It's also important to consider the diminutive size of Israel in relation to its Arab neighbors, many of which have not accepted Israel's right to exist and are still officially in a state of war with her. Here, on a map of the Middle East, Israel is practically indistinguishable. And in relation to other regions, Israel is minute. Yet it was still willing to give up its land for peace. So, how did each side live up to its end of the land for peace agreement? In accordance with its commitment to transfer land, over the 5-year period, Israel relinquished to the PA 42% of the West Bank and over 90% of the Gaza Strip. This meant that 98% of the Palestinian population was no longer under Israeli control and were now subject to the jurisdiction of Yasser Arafat and the PA.
By the way, the only country in the world in modern history that was willing to give part of its ancestral homeland after it won all the battles and all the campaigns against an aggressor enemy, give back or give away part of its ancestral homeland in the hope that this will bring about peace. The only one.
And so Israel complied with its agreement to recognize the PA, as well as to transfer lands to the Palestinians. In accordance with its commitment to educate for peace, Israel embarked on a major campaign to win its population over to the ideals of Oslo.
There was a total change in Israeli policy. In fact, Israel suddenly began saying, we are for the PLO, that we want international recognition of the PLO, that we believe that if the PLO is strengthened, that this is going to bring us security.
They started real propaganda for peace. Everybody started speaking in Israeli society about the future peace. Children in the schools had lessons about the peace.
Peace was indoctrinated in all schools at all levels. A non-governmental organization, the Center for Monitoring the Impact of Peace, conducted a survey of 360 Israeli textbooks in order to determine how they related to peace and tolerance.
Israel made this commitment in Oslo to educate them for peace. The truth is, Israeli school books, even before Oslo, were positive and were separating between the conflict and the Arabs themselves. Since Oslo, Israel has been very, very actively talking about Oslo, referring to Oslo, teaching about Oslo as opening a new dawn of peace.
Israel was so determined to educate for peace that severe steps were taken against those refusing to cooperate.
Being against Oslo, you were suddenly called anti-peace.
At some moment, it became almost impossible to criticize the Oslo road to peace, because nobody wanted to be associated with those who are shooting into peace.
Despite the intense education campaign, not all Israelis were convinced. However, Israelis were shocked when one of their own turned to terror. In 1995, a Jewish militant assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, claiming he was frustrated by the peace process, that the transfer of lands weren't bringing peace, only more dead Jews. However, the overall success of the Israeli education campaign is reflected in public opinion polls. Prior to Oslo, only 28% of Israelis supported the creation of a Palestinian state. Most were afraid of the security threat, whereas in the years following Oslo, the figures jumped to over 51%.
You see today that more and more Israelis, even though they are right-wing, put in Likud or something, they understand today that the Palestinians deserve a state.
And so Israel fulfilled its Oslo commitment to educate for peace. Israel also supplied the PA security forces with thousands of arms and munitions.
The new Palestinian security forces moved in to take the place of the Israelis, but the order didn't last long, as seemingly everyone with access to a weapon fired jubilant volleys into the air.
Israel was in compliance with its Oslo commitment to supply arms. But Israel was not perfect in its adherence to the Oslo Accords. At the very time Israel signed the agreements, it was building and expanding Jewish settlements in the West Bank on lands that the Palestinians were hoping would become a part of the new Palestinian homeland. Although settlement building was permissible, according to the Oslo Accords, Palestinians saw this expansion as contrary to the spirit of the Accords, and that it could undermine the creation of a future Palestinian state.
The Oslo Accords did not include requirements of Israel about the settlements, so there wasn't much for Israel to do there.
Even if Israel didn't sign anything regarding settlements, I don't think that it was wise to keep building the settlements while we are in a peace process. Because this is, again, another thing that will bring hatred between two sides and stop the peace process moving forward.
Others criticize Israel because it delayed in its transfer of lands over to PA control. In fact, the final transfer didn't take place at all. Israel said that this was because of the rampant terror at the time. In other words, the lack of PA compliance. In the end, however, the public record testifies the other land transfers did in fact take place, along with Israel's fulfillment of its other major Oslo commitments. And how did the Palestinians do? The PA's key commitment at Oslo was to bring an end to terror. After the signing of the accords, the killings were expected to stop, or at the very least, to drastically subside.
ראיתי ראש של בן אדם ליד הרגליים וידיים מפותחים. אנשים צועקים, תעזרו לי, תעזרו לנו.
We gave 42% of the land. Did we get 40% of peace? Did we get even 20% of peace? Talking about the formula, land for peace.
מיוחדת של הרבנות הצבאית וחברה קדישא אוספים את האיברים. כל חלק יובא לקבורה.
We didn't get anything in return.
More Israelis were killed in the 5 years following Oslo than in the previous 15 years combined. 279 men, women, and children were murdered in 92 lethal terror attacks. Deliberate acts of violence carried out against Israeli civilians by Palestinians.
We wanted to believe in peace, only to be shocked back to reality, only to get that wake-up call, you know, from Yasser Arafat when the first suicide, homicide bombings and killings started after Oslo.
Scenes like these were becoming frighteningly commonplace.
הבקבוק נכנס לתוך הרכב, האש התפשטה ועברה אחורנית, שלב ישבה מאחורנית בכיסא תינוק. והיא הייתה מוקד האש. זהו, שלב נפגע מאוד מאוד קשה. הבעיה הייתה שהייתה כלואה בתוך הכיסא, היה לי מאוד קשה לחלץ אותה. האצבעות יד שמאל נשרפו ונפלו.
Kobe was in 8th grade, and he was an adventurous boy. Apparently they went hiking. They didn't tell us, of course. And they were met by terrorists who stoned them to death, beat them to death, and left them there.
The PA was in violation of its primary Oslo commitment to end terror. When Israeli civilians are murdered, the PA comes out to condemn the attacks.
President Arafat said, I want to be very clear, we are against any and every operation targeting civilians, whether they are Israelis or Palestinians.
The PA's second Oslo commitment was to wipe out all terror organizations. When terror groups like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, or the PFLP claim responsibility for their deadly attacks, the PA claims innocence. After all, these groups are apparently violently opposed to the peace process, as well as to the Palestinian Authority itself.
We are against PLO because Mr. Arafat put his hand on Rabin's hand.
But if the PA was taking steps to stamp out terror groups like Hamas, Israelis asked themselves why Yasser Arafat was seen on Palestinian television publicly praising Hamas terrorists.
وأنا بقول هذا الكلام في ذكرى هؤلاء الشهداء الأبطال العظام أبو إياد وأبو الهول وأبو محمد وقبلهم أبو جهاد وقبلهم يحيى عياش وبعدهم يحيى عياش.
Yahya Ayash, also known as the engineer, was the mastermind behind the first suicide bombings, a series of attacks that claimed more than 50 lives.
أطلب منكم يا إخواني قراءة الفاتحة على جميع شهدائنا وآخرهم الشهيد المهندس يحيى عياش.
There's no doubt inside U.S. intelligence that the Palestinian Authority is involved in terrorism. When Arafat's headquarters were raided, it was beyond a shadow of a doubt. There were documents showing that Arafat was involved with money laundering, with signing purchase orders for how many, suicide bomb vests we're going to make.
The records reveal that for years, the PA has been supplying terror groups with funds, resources, and arms to carry out their attacks. The U.S. agreed that the PA was behind the shipment of over 50 tons of illegal, sophisticated weaponry found on the Karine A ship, seized in 2002.
We cannot separate PA from the terrorist organizations like Hamas and Martyr Brigade and everything else. They are the different heads of one hydra.
The PA neither banned the terror organizations, declaring them illegal, nor did they confiscate their weapons. Instead of stamping out terror groups, the PA colludes with them in acts of terror. An organization's charter defines its philosophy and goals, which is why it was encouraging when the PA agreed to amend the PLO charter that calls for the destruction of Israel through violence.
One of the fundamental promises the Palestinians made in the Oslo process was that they would remove those lines from the Palestinian charter calling for the death and destruction of the State of Israel.
Israel wants the PLO's charter annulled because this says armed struggle is the only way of liberating Palestine, and continues, it is Arabs' duty to liquidate the Zionist presence.
In 1998, 5 years after Oslo, the charter still had not been amended. Only after intense international pressure, culminating in a visit by President Clinton to Gaza, did the PA take its first small step.
To make it clear and unequivocal that they are choosing the path of peace and partnership with Israel.
Under Clinton's influencing presence, the PA's governing body, the PNC, agreed to suggest changes to the charter.
Instead of changing the charter, they put out sort of a wishy-washy memo saying that certain portions of the charter no longer apply. But to this day, the Palestinian charter remains as it originally was written, containing the very provisions calling for the destruction of the State of Israel.
The charter are amended, 100%. So don't come to tell me that once again it's not amended. I'm telling you, go to the Palestinian website, you find it.
At the time of completion of this film, the updated charter was not to be found on any official PA websites. And until such time, the amendments to the PLO charter are considered as in doubt. At Oslo, the Palestinians also committed themselves to protect the Jewish holy sites that fell under their jurisdiction in the transfer of land. Not only did the Palestinians not permit Jewish worshippers to safely visit numerous holy sites, but the PA police often turned a blind eye to angry Palestinian mobs who constantly throw stones and fire bullets at Jews who come to pray at Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem. The ancient Peace for Israel synagogue in Jericho was destroyed by Palestinian mobs, as was Joseph's tomb in Nablus.
The flag goes up and Palestinians celebrate their new presence in a shrine which Israel had continued to control as an isolated enclave in the Palestinian town of Nablus.
رحلوا تماما
They've left forever. They will never come back, says Mahmoud al-Alul, the Palestinian governor of Nablus. God willing, he adds, they will evacuate all their outposts and all our homeland. Later, the initial delight became unbridled Palestinian joy. The crowd, which effectively took over control from their policemen, set on fire Israeli artifacts left behind. Many people set about tearing the shrine down with pickaxes and iron bars.
As Torah scrolls, Bibles, and other ancient holy items burn at the hands of the Palestinians, the PA is in violation of yet another Oslo agreement to protect Jewish holy sites. The Palestinians also committed to educate their people towards peace and tolerance. After Oslo, the PA controlled or influenced all Palestinian TV, radio, and newspapers. Theirs were not messages of peace. These are typical Friday sermons broadcast on official Palestinian television.
فهذا هو شأن اليهود فلا ترحموا اليهود في أي موقع كان وفي أي موطن قاتلوهم أينما كنتم حيثما ثقفتموهم فاقتلوهم. هنيئا لمن وضع حزاما ناسفا على نفسه أو على أبنائه ودخل في أعماق اليهود وقال الله أكبر ولله الحمد لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
The Palestinian religious leaders appear every Friday on Palestinian television giving sermons from various mosques, and their message is uniform.
فاليهود هم اليهود هؤلاء هم الذين يجب أن يذبحوا ويجب أن يقتلوا.
They are teaching their people that they have the obligation now, the religious obligation from Allah to murder Jews.
هنيئا لمن ادخر طلقة واحدة يضعها في رأس يهودي.
Kobe was killed for being a Jew. He wasn't killed because of land. He was killed only because he's a Jew and because the Arabs are taught to hate Jews.
I condemn completely these terrorist activities.
The question was, is the same message that's being presented to the world being presented to their own people?
Yasser Arafat had, in a speech made last week in South Africa, apparently spoken of a jihad or holy war to liberate Jerusalem. But then the PLO chairman explained he'd been using jihad as a metaphor.
I can say that I will continue my jihad to achieve real peace. This is the part. Some extremists had changed the religious terminology to a political terminology. It is not my fault.
الأرض مقابل السلام، الأرض مقابل السلام، مش الأمن مقابل السلام، مش الأمن مقابل السلام، مش الأمن مقابل السلام.
There is hardly a Palestinian who is spared the messages of the PA's media policy. Countless newspaper articles, radio and television programs sing the praises of suicide bombers and honor their families. Blatant commands to hate and murder Jews are found everywhere. Pictures of suicide bombers and terrorists decorate Palestinian homes, streets, and schools. Suicide bombers have become the role model for Palestinian children, the ultimate hero that every child aspires to be. hopes of peace and reconciliation rest with the younger generation. In PA-controlled schools, however, these hopes are systematically crushed. The same institution that monitored Israeli textbooks also conducted a comprehensive survey of all 60 Palestinian textbooks introduced into the school system after the Oslo Accords. In none of the Palestinian textbooks is peace with Israel mentioned. In none of the textbooks is the Oslo peace process cited. In none of the textbooks do they mention the connection that Jews have had to the land for the past 3,500 years. In none of the Palestinian textbooks and maps does Israel even exist. On the other hand, the Fedai, or guerrilla, and the Shahid, or suicide martyr, are praised as spearheads of the Palestinian struggle.
Here you have an example from a 7th grade school book. This picture of a dead child here being carried aloft as a heroic Shahid follows a poem called The Shahid, which literally glorifies children or individuals who go out and die. So for example, one of the texts in this poem is, "I see my death, yet I hasten my steps toward it."
لعمرك إني أرى مصرعي ولكني أسرع إليه الخطى.
And here you see a picture of a child, so that were the child to think this possibly is talking about adults, no, it's not. Here you see a dead child being carried aloft as a hero.
لعمرك هذا ممات الرجال ومن رام موت الفداء فداء. صوت الحجر صوت الغاصبين ايدين صغير بحجر تتحدى المعتدين. ودم يطير بالفضا وينادي على حطين وينادي وين عمر وين صلاح الدين.
The PA received funds from the U.S. and European Union to send tens of thousands of Palestinian children to what was thought to be summer camps filled with friends, games, and swimming. In 2000, the New York Times exposed these summer camps as nothing short of paramilitary training camps.
Y también me gustaría saber que me explicara por qué Al-Fatah entrena a niños para que salgan con armas a la calle, poniendo en riesgo clarísimamente sus vidas. Gracias.
¿Estabas con ellos? Estabas tú con ellos. Dame una prueba de que tú lo que dices es verdad, es cierto. Tú me preguntas una pregunta.
ومثل ما بقول مثل ما أنا قلت إنه جنرالاتنا الجدد أطفالنا.
سيدي الرئيس، ما هي الرسالة التي تريد أن توصلها إلى الشعب الفلسطيني بشكل عام والأطفال فلسطين بشكل خاص؟
بقول هذا الطفل اللي بيمسك الحجر قدام الدبابة مش أكبر رسالة للعالم وبيستشهد هذا البطل؟
المجموعة الانتحارية
المجموعة الانتحارية
لم جنزر ولا نصف جنزر
فإحنا فخورين بهم.
The Palestinian Authority is really manipulating children for their own gains. The Palestinian people are tired of the Palestinian Authority making war on the backs of babies, but they are powerless to do anything about it.
On the PA's television network, even the children's shows are laced with incitement.
إذا احتجت على باب القدس أصبحت فدائيا أصبحت فدائيا بزي مقاتلي بزي مقاتلي بزي مقاتلي
TV talk shows reflect and reinforce the attitudes of the Palestinian youth.
معنا أيضا أعزائي المشاهدين ولاء الطويل، ولاء أيضا بالصف السادس 11 عام يا ولاء. حكيت عن الشهادة كشيء جميل، أنت بتعتقد أنه شيء جميل؟
الشهادة كتير شيء جميل جدا جدا، كل الناس بتتمنى الشهادة. لأنه يعني إيش في أحلى من إنك تروحي على الجنة.
مين أفضل، السلام مع وجود حقوق كاملة للشعب الفلسطيني ولا الشهادة؟
الشهادة. أنا أخذ حقي بعدين أستشهد، لأنه بدنا نعيش إحنا حياتنا.
ولكني إذا ما جئت آكل لحم مغتصبي، حذاري من جوع ومن.
So I think the worst form of child abuse is teaching a child to hate. Now here's where the Palestinian Authority didn't just break the Oslo Agreement, they shattered it. These are kindergarten kids being taught to be suicide bombers.
The PA have failed in their commitment to educate their nation towards peace. The PA did not comply with any of the major commitments it signed at Oslo.
Both of us commit mistakes, but not intentional mistake from our side. But the Israeli, they are destroying Oslo systematically. So don't blame the Palestinians that they are not implementing Oslo. The Palestinians are the occupied people, are not the occupier.
Oslo was a promise of peace. It was supposed to be a process in which both sides met their mutual agreements to move the peace process forward. The Israelis kept their part pretty much. The Palestinians didn't even make a pretense of going along with the Oslo Agreement.
Oslo promised land for peace. The Palestinians received land, but the Israelis did not get peace.
Yasser Arafat, who was touted as this peacemaker and this great leader, never changed his stripes. He remained the terrorist in 1993 that he was in 1964 when he formed the Fatah.
In light of these failures, one might have expected that the Oslo dream would end, and all negotiations with the Palestinian Authority would cease. But Israelis so desired peace that they elected Ehud Barak as prime minister, in the hopes that he could accomplish the impossible. At Camp David and Taba in 2000, Barak offered greater concessions than any previous Israeli leader.
How long is it going to take, Mr. President?
How is it going, Mr. President?
We pledged to each other we would answer no questions and offer no comments. So I have to set a good example.
Here's what Israel offered. The creation of a Palestinian state, which would include control and ownership of up to 97% of the West Bank and 100% of the Gaza Strip. This would mean the removal and dismantling of most of the Jewish settlements in those areas. These included settlements built during the Oslo years. Jerusalem would become the shared capital of the new Palestinian state. The PA would control all of Arab East Jerusalem, which included 70% of the Old City and the entire Temple Mount. Israel also offered the return of an undisclosed amount of Palestinian refugees into Israel proper, and financial compensation for those not included in the return. As the leaders stood on the verge of a breakthrough, the world realized that Barak was acquiescing to all of the original Palestinian demands. This despite the fact that the PA had not lived up to any of its trust-building Oslo agreements. But the laughter didn't last long. Arafat rejected the offer flat out and left the negotiations without so much as a single counteroffer. The PA then launched the Intifada. The Palestinians would have the world believe that the current armed struggle was sparked by Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But the PA Minister of Communications tells us otherwise.
بسبب زيارة الحقير شارون إلى المسجد الأقصى، ولكن هذه الانتفاضة كانت معدة سابقا منذ عودة القائد الرئيس من مفاوضات كامب ديفيد الأخيرة، عندما قام الطاولة هناك في وجه الرئيس المنصرف كلينتون، عندما وقف وتحداه ورفض الشروط الأمريكية في القلب الأمريكي.
Arafat rejected it. 95% of the land, or more, 98%, a part of Jerusalem, and they rejected it.
وبالتالي كان أخو الرئيس الأول الذي يقول لأمريكا بالفم الملآن الوافق بأنه يرفض الشروط الأمريكية وهو في قلب أمريكا. نعم.
Our people is continuing their road to Jerusalem, the capital of our independent Palestinian state. To accept or not to accept, let him go to hell.
So why did the PA reject the peace offers? What do they really want?
What we say that we want the 22% of historical Palestine, which is the West Bank and Gaza Strip.
We have the same messages coming from political leaders. The same messages coming from religious leaders.
لو وقعت اتفاقيات غزة والضفة الغربية فلن ننسى حيفا وعكا والجليل ويافا.
Same messages being given to children in the schools.
هذه فلسطين مش للصهاينة. هذه فلسطين مش للصهاينة.
And it's a uniform message. Israel is temporary. Israel will be destroyed.
أعطونا السلاحين، أسلحة يأتونا، أعطوني البنات وأنا بمسحهم بس، أعطوني بقتلهم كلياتهم، ما بنخليش ولا يهودي نحن، ما بنخليش ولا يهودي هنا.
The reason Arafat doesn't want peace is because he doesn't want Israel.
In every map, in every school book, this is the way they present Palestine. All of Israel is erased. Israel doesn't exist. Israel doesn't exist. Israel doesn't exist. This is the Palestine that teach the people to expect and to anticipate in the future.
They're not interested ultimately in just the West Bank and Gaza. They're interested in Israel proper.
There was an interview with Faisal Husseini where he said explicitly that the Oslo Accords are a Trojan horse to get inside Israel to continue the battle. He said no Palestinian can give up any part of Palestine from Metula to Eilat, and that the purpose of the Oslo Accords is ultimately to weaken Israel and destroy Israel.
Arafat's strategy was not a strategy of peace. He never committed himself to peace, to real peace. What he really wanted is to continue the armed struggle.
It happens very, very quickly. It explodes. It's like an explosion of blood.
We're sick of our blood on the walls. We're sick of it.
بدنا نفديك يا شهيد. طيب انتوا ليش بتعملوا هيك مثلا؟
هيك
عشان ايش؟
عشان نقتل اليهود.
one has to ask oneself, what is the goal of the Palestinian struggle? Is it simply to create an independent Palestinian state? Or is it also to see the elimination of the Jewish state? Could it be that today's conflict is really a continuation of the Arab struggle against the Jewish return to its historic homeland, a struggle that began long before the Israeli state was even born?
I think the conflict remains, as it always has been, basically over the question, shall Israel exist or not?
The original plan, which compelled Arabs to attack Israel in 1948, has always been in operation.
Israel's asserting its right to exist, the Arabs are rejecting that right.
Israel took sincere steps towards peace and is paying for its risk-taking by having its worst nightmare come true. In the 10 years since the signing of the Oslo Agreement, over 1,000 Israelis have been murdered in terror attacks. In the 3-year period from Camp David alone, Israel was overwhelmed by almost 20,000 terror attacks, which included over 150 suicide bombers. Palestinian life has also become increasingly difficult. The IDF has posted countless roadblocks in and around Palestinian towns and villages. The result? Palestinians' daily lives are severely compromised and disrupted.
And this is a harassment, a daily harassment for the whole category of a population.
Restrictions on the everyday lives of Palestinians are now harsher than they were 10 years ago. Brand new fences and walls, just the visible evidence of the present reality.
It is not a real life. It is a jail. It's a prison.
However, when Palestinian cars and ambulances filled with deadly arms and explosives are intercepted by the Israelis, one understands that the checkpoints are not tools of Israeli aggression, but rather the first line of defense against potential terror attacks. And in Israel's war against terror, innocent Palestinians have been caught in the crossfire and been wounded or killed. And one has to wonder, was this not the very pain the Oslo Accords were designed to prevent? Perhaps it could be said that more than Israel has hurt the Palestinian people, the Palestinians have been hurt by their own leaders. Leaders who could have inspired their people towards peace, but chose instead to rail against the Jewish state and instill a suicidal hatred of the Jews in their people.
هذا هو المطلوب الآن القرب من الله التمسك بحبل الله ثم بعد ذلك لتستعد الجموع المستشهدة تستعد لدخول الجنة الجنة مفتحة الآن الجنة من أراد أن يدخل الجنة الآن دون أن يعيش في البرزخ ما عليه إلا أن يستشهد ستستقبله في الجنة 70 حورية.
That hatred has led to terror. Polls reveal that 59% of Palestinians support the continued armed struggle against Israel, even if Palestinians gain full statehood in the entire West Bank and Gaza regions, with East Jerusalem as their capital. And 72% of Gazan children polled in 2001 expressed the desire to be suicide bombers. Surely, not all Palestinians feel this way. One such individual is Zoya Hamdan, who, in an unprecedented move, collected over 10,000 signatures from Jerusalem Arabs, protesting against Yasser Arafat's corruptive leadership and failure to accept Israel's peace offers. He was shot 5 times, allegedly by members of Yasser Arafat's Fatah organization in 2001. He survived.
There are some Palestinians who do see that Israel is there permanently, but they're not the majority, and they're not the ones who have the megaphone, they're not the ones who have power.
Radical Islamic terror does not only endanger Jews in Israel.
كلهم كاذبون أينما تكونون فاقتلوا أولئك اليهود ومن لف لفهم من الأمريكان ومن وقف معهم فإنهم جميعا في.
And radical Islamic terrorism does not only endanger Jews.
It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
On the day the entire civilized world stopped, paralyzed by terror, Palestinians dance in the streets.
It's like Israel is the heart of the world, and it's happening here. But what happens in the heart of the world spreads to the rest of the body. And what we're seeing now is it's spreading.
Guys, this is horrendous. I've never seen anything like it. People are burnt everywhere. There's people dead.
And what we're seeing now is it's spreading. And it will keep spreading until the world stands up and says that you have to fight terror.
Terror is a crime against humanity. The fence now under construction is meant to provide protection from Palestinian terror attacks, attacks against which the Palestinian Authority has consistently refused to act, attacks that have caused and continue to cause horrific bloodshed. With murderous suicide bombings on the rise since October 2000, Israel's government saw the need to erect a fence that could prevent the murderers from reaching their targets. Had the Palestinian leadership abided by its pledge to act against terror, there would never have been a need for a fence. It's just a 15-minute walk from the Palestinian city of Qalqilia to the Israeli city of Kfar Saba. Just 15 minutes. In some places, just 12 kilometers separate the route of the fence from the Mediterranean Sea. In the long run, by preventing terrorism, the fence will actually encourage dialogue with the Palestinians, no longer hampered by the influence of terrorists determined to destroy the peace process. The numbers speak for themselves. Not a single suicide bomber has gotten past the security fence built around the Gaza Strip. In those parts of the West Bank where the fence has been completed, terrorist activities have dropped by some 50%. Hundreds of people have been saved from injury and death. The Berlin Wall was built to stop people from fleeing to freedom. The security fence serves exactly the opposite purpose. It prevents terrorists from attacking innocent civilians. It's not a wall, it's a fence. In fact, just 20 kilometers of the total 730 planned, less than 3%, take the form of a wall. And that's only where the danger of shooting attacks requires a solid structure. Israel shares the same moral commitment of all democratic countries to enable its people to live in the truest sense of the word. Suicide attacks carried out in Israel have victimized both Jews and Arabs, men and women, senior citizens and small children from various ethnic and religious groups, tourists and permanent residents, foreign workers and new immigrants. Security fence is meant to protect all of them. Yes, indeed. This fence is meant to separate people, to separate terrorist murderers from innocent civilians. There's a delicate equation here which forces us to weigh the right to freedom of movement against the right to life. Israel is doing everything possible to minimize the damage caused by the fence. It strives to ease the situation of civilians who feel that the fence impinges upon them. Yes, it's a security fence, but it's being built with maximum consideration for the needs of the Palestinian population. The fence will include 41 gates for farmers, 11 crossing points, and 5 terminals for the transfer of goods. Israel has replanted more than 63,000 olive trees for Palestinian farmers to ensure their livelihood despite construction of the fence. All Palestinian civilians are free to lodge formal complaints and to appeal any decisions made. Israel makes every attempt to take such complaints into account. While focused on the prevention of terror attacks, Israel stands ready to consider changing the route of the fence wherever it disrupts the lives of Palestinian civilians. The few landowners affected by the construction of the fence have been offered compensation for their lands and for their harvests of the next 5 years, while they retain legal ownership of their property. This fence is for security, so it must follow a route that ensures security. The green line is not a security line, it's a political line. The fence is not a border. Final borders will be determined only through negotiations. The fence is meant to serve one and only one purpose: to prevent terrorists from carrying out murderous attacks in buses, schools, and restaurants. It's not a border and not a substitute for a border. It's a temporary step that Israel feels compelled to take until the Palestinian Authority finally puts an end to the terror being carried out with its approval and financial and moral support, and enters into a comprehensive peace agreement. It simply isn't the case. The security fence is temporary, meant to provide self-defense. It can be dismantled and moved within days. It's a phenomenon that can be reversed, unlike the deaths of all those killed by the terrorists. Israel has already moved fences as a result of political agreements. That's what it did along its borders with Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. In fact, Israel moved its Lebanese border security fence no less than 12 times. The anti-terror fence is a matter of self-defense. It's a pragmatic, effective, temporary measure necessitated endless terror attacks. When the terror ends, so will the need for the fence.